The condition, originally named Apotemnophilia, now called Body Integrity Identity Disorder, or BIID, is the all-consuming desire to become disabled. Most sufferers are obsessed with having one or more of their healthy limbs amputated. Others wish to become blind or deaf. In almost all cases, it starts in childhood, and by the time BIID sufferers are adults, the presence of their healthy limbs, eyes, or ears drives most of them to a deep depression. Therapy and medication are rarely helpful, but finding a surgeon or hospital willing to perform a medically unnecessary maiming is, well, next to impossible. So, this leaves those with BIID one option: removing the limbs themselves. Shotguns, log splitters, and even homemade guillotines have done the job for some. But the gold standard would be dry ice. For those who can stand the pain long enough, freezing the offending limb solid will guarantee amputation and ensure that it's unsalvageable, removing the risk of a well-meaning surgeon attempting to sew it back on. The first mention of the condition in the literature is in a 1785 text written by French surgeon Jean-Joseph Sue. He describes an Englishman who was so distressed by the presence of his healthy leg that he tried to pay a surgeon 100 guineas to amputate it. The surgeon refused, claiming that he didn't have the correct implements, but quickly changed his mind when the Englishman produced a gun. The amputation was a success, and a while later the surgeon received 250 guineas from the Englishman, along with a letter that read, "You have made me the happiest of all men by taking away from me a limb, which put an invisible obstacle to my happiness." Unsurprisingly, the condition is incredibly rare, and it was almost 200 years before it was studied and named. This work was completed in 1977 by psychologists Greg Firth, a BIID sufferer himself, and John Money. The same John Money, by the way, who'd go on to reassign the gender of an injured baby boy, make him live as a girl, and then sexually assault him and his brother by forcing them to take part in child sexual rehearsal play. As you might have guessed, Money's interest lay in sexual dysfunction and paraphilias, intense sexual urges or behaviors involving unusual objects or activities that cause significant distress. For example, pedophilia, necrophilia, and dendrophilia, the sexual attraction to trees. He and Firth had just 2 patients in their study who both possessed a sexual attraction to becoming an amputee. Thus, the psychologists coined the term Apotemnophilia, from the Greek apo, meaning away from, temno, meaning piece cut off, and philia, meaning love. Money and Firth's work firmly put the condition in the category of psychological or psychiatric disorder for the next few decades. However, in the late 1990s, a case would hit the press that had shed new light on apotemnophilia and caused researchers to question everything they thought they knew. In 1996, surgeon Robert Smith was approached by Kevin Wright, a man desperate to remove the lower portion of his leg. Not because it caused him any pain or because he was aroused by the thought of amputation, but because he didn't feel like it was a part of him. He'd felt this way for 30 years, and by the time he found Smith, he was close to suicide. Smith submitted Wright for 2 separate psychological evaluations and took a year and a half to consider the case. Eventually, he concluded that surgery was the only way to help the patient, and he performed the amputation at the NHS Falkirk and District Royal Infirmary. And it worked. Wright was over the moon, stating, "I have happiness and contentment, and life is so much more settled, so much easier." Following the success of the first case, Smith performed another amputation in 1999. But by the time he was approached by a third sufferer, the trust had a new board of managers, the hospital's ethics committee got involved, and they banned all future amputations of healthy limbs. While Smith's attempt to help BID sufferers had quickly been shut down, the resulting publicity sent shockwaves through the medical community. Here was a doctor with the backing of 2 psychiatrists publicly stating there was another type of apotemnophilia that was not driven by sexual desire, but by a body dysmorphic disorder. A distinction that Smith said was possible to make with close questioning. He wasn't the first doctor to suggest this. A few case studies published in the 1980s had come to a similar conclusion, but it was the first time that the issue had received significant attention. For every step forward for BIID sufferers, there was a step back. In the year 2000, Wright was outed for his involvement with a website called Overground, an online support group for people attracted to those with disabilities. This blew huge holes in his stories that it needed an amputation for dysmorphia rather than for a sexual fetish, and it completely destroyed Smith's claim that he could distinguish between the two. The issue became a huge stumbling block, because a surgeon might be willing to remove a leg if it was causing a patient unbearable discomfort, but no reputable doctor would ever agree to amputate to provide someone with sexual gratification. This was not a fight that could be resolved quickly, and in the meantime, people were suffering and taking matters into their own hands. The most high-profile case was that of Roland Bowen, a famous cricket historian and author. He'd already removed his own finger and explained it away as a kitchen mishap, but it hadn't been enough. So in September 1968, he sat in his bath with a hacksaw, hammer, and a chisel and amputated his right leg. Then he limped his way to the phone and called an ambulance for a surgical cleanup. At the time, BIID was even less well known than it is today, and newspapers ran with the story that he did it just to prove that it could be done. Seems reasonable work there, journalists. In 1996, another BIID sufferer, 38-year-old Mark Comer, reached his breaking point. Rather than attempt the amputation himself, his plan was to damage his leg so badly that it couldn't be saved, and doctors would be forced to remove it. So he bought a concrete parking bollard, took it to his garage, sat beside it, and then dropped it onto his leg. Tragically for him, damage to the bone wasn't extensive enough, and he didn't get his wish. In the year 2000, another sufferer, who gives the false name Carl in interviews, succeeded in what's now regarded as the gold standard in limb removal among the BIID community. Over the course of 6 hours, he sat with his leg in a bucket, which he kept topping up with dry ice. Using his knowledge of thermodynamics, it calculated exactly what would be required to freeze the full thickness and guaranteed that within a few days his blackened flesh would fall away and leave nothing for surgeons to save. He was right, and within a month, he was a double amputee. The next breakthrough came in 2005 in a study published by the American psychiatrist Michael First. It systematically described the disorder in 52 patients and revealed a few surprising patterns. Firstly, men were far more likely to suffer from the affliction than women. Secondly, most patients were requesting left-side amputations. And finally, leg amputation was by far the most common request. Another key finding was that 65% had received psychotherapy and none had reported any reduction in their desire for amputation. First also used the study to coin the term Body Integrity Identity Disorder, or BIID. It later explained, quote, "The name that was originally proposed, Apotemnophilia, was clearly a problem. We wanted a word that was parallel to gender identity disorder. GID has built into the name a concept that there is a function called gender identity, or which is your sense of being male or female, which has gone wrong. So, what would be a parallel notion? Body Integrity Identity Disorder hypothesizes that a normal function, which is your comfort in how your body fits together, has gone wrong." End quote. This opened the doors for researchers to investigate the condition from a neurological point of view rather than a psychiatric one, and in 2008, researchers from the University of California would prove it in a groundbreaking study. They noted that the patient's preference for left-side amputation and disconnection from a limb bore striking parallels to the symptoms of somatoparaphrenia. This is a condition caused by damage to the right parietal lobe, the part of the brain responsible for constructing body image. They wondered if a disorder in this lobe could provide a neurological explanation for BIID. To test their theory, they found 2 individuals with the condition who could identify the exact point where their leg went from being theirs to something foreign that needed to be removed. Then they measured skin conductance response to a pinprick from both above and below that line, and the results were startling. For one patient, there was a 2-fold difference in skin response, and for the other, it was 3-fold. This indicated a congenital deformity in the right parietal lobe that was distorting body image and missing limbs from the brain's body map, causing them to feel foreign. Unfortunately, there's currently no cure for genetic mishaps in the brain, which leaves amputation as the only treatment option. But this is something that very few surgeons or hospitals are willing to do. So the self-mutilation has continued. In 2001, George Boyer became so desperate that he decided the only way to free himself was to shoot off his leg with a shotgun. So to avoid a messy cleanup, he went into his garden and blasted a hole in his leg just above the knee. Unfortunately, the cordless phone he'd taken with him to call for help was out of range, and he almost bled out before he was found by his landlady and taken to the ER. Their doctors wanted to attempt a repair, but he fought with them for amputation. And he won. In 2015, Jules Shupping, a BIID sufferer whose condition drove her to crave blindness, enlisted the help of her sympathetic psychologist. Together they applied numbing eye drops and then drain cleaner to her eyes. The pain was excruciating, even with the drops, and she recalled, "My eyes were screaming, and I had some drain cleaner going down my cheek, burning my skin. But all I could think was, I am going blind. It is going to be okay." At first she thought she'd failed, as when she woke up the next day she could still see. But the damage was done. Her left eye went into corneal meltdown and her right became covered in a web of scars. It took 6 months, but she'd finally lost her vision and, tragically, her family, who disowned her after discovering that she'd done it on purpose. For those who can't face the excruciating agony of dry ice and don't own a gun, finding a willing surgeon is their only shot at happiness. But it's fraught with risk, not only for the doctors who could lose the right to practice medicine, but for the patients who could lose their lives if they put their trust in the wrong scalpel. For example, in 1998, an American, Philip Bondi, decided that pursuing an amputation on the black market was his only way forward. This led him to Mexico, where he paid a former doctor, John Brown, $10,000 to cut off his leg. Tragically, he died 2 days later in his hotel room after gangrene set in, and Brown was sentenced to 15 years in prison for his role in Bondi's death. Coincidentally, Bondi had been accompanied by another wannabe amputee on his trip to Mexico, Greg Firth. And if that name's ringing a bell, here is the psychologist who worked with money. He had intended to undergo surgery at the same time as Bondi, but wisely changed his mind when the Mexican doctor who was set to assist Brown walked into the clinic brandishing a butcher's knife. But this wouldn't be Firth's only experience with black market surgeons. 40 years ago, most BIID sufferers were isolated and convinced that they were the only ones afflicted with the condition. This was the case for one man, known only as Patrick, who grew up in a small town in America. That is, until his teenage obsession with amputees took him to the state capitol's library in search of books on the subject. At first, he was pretty frustrated to find that all the pictures had been cut out, but then he realized what that meant. There was someone else out there who was just like him. In fact, there were thousands, but he had no way to find them. However, it wasn't long before the internet fixed that. BIID sufferers became able to connect and form online groups like the one run by Kevin Wright, and they gave themselves a name: wannabes. This allowed for meetings, connections, and soon an underground way to organize a black market amputation. Of course, not just anyone could be trusted with the names and locations of willing surgeons, so the process had to have a gatekeeper, and that man was Greg Firth. Firth would watch and analyze the wannabes and weed out those whose affliction could lead to suicide or self-mutilation. Then he'd approach them and offer them a surgical option. One of the chosen ones was Patrick, who, since his teenage days in the library, had removed his own finger by soaking it in ice and alcohol, knocking it off with a hammer and a chisel, and smashing it for good measure. Quote, so they couldn't reattach it even if they wanted to. When Firth approached him at a meeting, offering to hook him up with the surgeon, Patrick was ecstatic. He'd previously considered lying with his leg on a train track, but was concerned he'd get sucked under. He didn't want to die. He just didn't want his leg. So he took Firth up on the offer, paid the cash, and headed to Asia for his surgery. Unlike Bondi's, this amputation was a success, and Patrick still raves about it. To quote, I wouldn't want my leg back for all the money in the world. That's how happy I am. Tragically for Firth, he was diagnosed with cancer and died in 2005 with both of his legs. He never got to know the relief that he'd arranged for others. Just before his death, though, he handed over the reins to Patrick, who spent the next decade arranging surgery for other wannabes. Of course, this was all totally illegal. To pull it off in an unsuspecting hospital, the surgeons would take the money on the side. Then the patients would admit themselves with a pre-bandaged leg and a script of symptoms requiring surgery. In theatre, the surgeon would just happen to uncover a complication that required amputation and remove the leg. The doctors say it's worth the risk for the chance to help people with a condition that medicine is refusing to cure, and the $20,000 per operation probably also helps a bit. Today, those fighting for the rights of BIID patients to control their bodies use the term transability and transabled and compare their struggles to those dealing with gender identity issues. Many are also choosing to sim as a way of coping with their symptoms. This involves simulating their desired disability by using a wheelchair, wearing blurred contact lenses, or walking with crutches, a practice that has drawn outrage from disability groups. So, what does the future hold for BIID sufferers? Well, the medical community is still very much divided. Some, like the black market surgeons, argue fiercely that these people should be helped and that almost none regret their amputations. They cite plastic surgery and gender reassignment surgery as legitimate comparisons where healthy tissue is removed to shape the body into something the patient wants to be. How is amputation for BIID any different? But others claim that it's not so simple. Plastic surgery doesn't intend to leave patients with disabilities and dependent on state help. Then there's the muddy issue of separating out those with a sexual fetish from those with a neurological condition. And finally, there's the issue of regret. Many in the transabled community claim this never happens, but at least one amputee has come forward to express his regret. Carl, the man who froze off both of his legs in dry ice. He said his obsession didn't end with his double amputation, and he craved more. So he tried intense therapy and antidepressants, and it worked. The success has been bittersweet, though, as he now knows he could have rid himself of the discomfort but kept his legs and the freedom they provided. He misses the beach and the feeling of the sand between his toes. Quote, "It's all the little things, like that. What the hell was I thinking?"